The alien girl's reputation. The bustling spaceport on the edge of the galaxy was alive with activity. Merchants shouted prices, travelers argued over tickets, and the occasional fight broke out between rowdy alien species. It was the kind of place where you learned to keep your head down and mind your own business. But today, all eyes were drawn to a small, solitary figure sitting quietly in the corner. The Petite alien girl sat at a scratched metal table, her head slightly bowed. Her size made her look almost harmless, but everyone in the room knew better. Her glowing blue eyes, partially hidden by the hood of her worn cloak, seemed to radiate a quiet power. A thin scar ran down her left cheek, a mark that only added to her air of mystery. The other travelers and workers in the spaceport kept their distance, whispering nervously among themselves. "That's her," a tall insect-like alien muttered to its companion. They say she can take down a whole gang with just her bare hands. I heard she once escaped a prison ship by herself." Another voice chimed in. "Nobody messes with her. Nobody." The stories about her were endless. Some said she had fought off deadly beasts on a jungle planet, while others claimed she had outsmarted a cartel of smugglers. No one knew for sure which tales were true, but it didn't matter. Her reputation alone was enough to keep everyone far away from her. Rai, however, didn't seem to notice the whispers, or maybe she just didn't care. She sat motionless, her fingers tapping lightly on the metal surface of the table. Her cloak was dusty, her boots scuffed, and her posture calm. But her glowing eyes scanned the room every few seconds, sharp and alert. She was waiting for something, or someone. At that moment, a human entered the spaceport. He was tall, with messy brown hair and a casual, confident stride. His clothes were plain, but the blaster strapped to his hip hinted that he wasn't just another traveler. His name was Jake, and he was known for being both reckless and curious. A dangerous combination. Jake's gaze swept over the room, pausing when it landed on Ray. He noticed how the other aliens avoided her, giving her a wide berth as if she carried some invisible danger. That only made him more interested. Jake wasn't the kind of person to avoid trouble. In fact, he usually went looking for it. "Who's the girl?" he asked the bartender, a gruff alien with 6 eyes. The bartender grunted. "Stay away from her, human. That's Rai. She's trouble. Big trouble." Jake smirked. "Trouble, huh? Sounds like my kind of company." The bartender's eyes widened. "Don't be a fool. No one talks to her and walks away unscathed." But Jake had already made up his mind. Ignoring the bartender's warnings, he strode across the room and sat down at Rhee's table without asking for permission. The entire spaceport seemed to hold its breath. Conversation stopped, and all eyes turned to the human who had just broken the unspoken rule. Rai didn't look up right away. Her fingers paused their tapping, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, slowly, she raised her head and met Jake's gaze. Her glowing blue eyes locked onto his, unblinking. Jake felt a shiver run down his spine, but he didn't flinch. He leaned back in his chair, acting casual, even though his instincts screamed at him to be on guard. "You look like you could use a drink," Jake said with a grin. Rai didn't smile. She didn't even blink. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was quiet but sharp, like the edge of a blade. "You're either very brave or very foolish." Jake chuckled. "Probably a bit of both." The tension in the room was so thick, it could have been cut with a knife. The other patrons were frozen in place, waiting to see what would happen. No one had ever dared to approach Rhee before, not like this. Some of them silently prayed for Jake, assuming he was about to meet a very messy end. Rai tilted her head slightly, studying the human in front of her. "What do you want?" she asked, her tone devoid of emotion. Jake shrugged. "You looked lonely. Thought I'd say hi." Her lips curved into something that might have been a smirk, though it vanished almost immediately. "Lonely," she repeated, as if testing the word. Then she leaned forward slightly, her glowing eyes narrowing. Let me give you some advice, human. Walk away. Now. Jake's grin didn't falter. What if I don't? For the first time, something flickered in Ree's expression, something between amusement and disbelief. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. Your funeral. The spaceport buzzed with nervous whispers again, but Jake ignored them. He was intrigued by this strange, dangerous girl. He didn't know her story yet, but one thing was clear. She wasn't like anyone he'd ever met before, and he wasn't going to walk away. Not yet. A dangerous offer. Jake's grin lingered as he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the cold metal table. The tension in the air was palpable, and the weight of every eye in the spaceport seemed to press down on him. Rye, however, didn't flinch. Her glowing eyes stared into his, unreadable and unblinking, like twin stars holding secrets of the cosmos. So, Jake said, trying to sound casual, are you always this friendly, or is today just special? Rye didn't laugh. Instead, she reached into her cloak and pulled out a small device, its surface smooth and black, marked with pulsing lines of green light. She placed it on the table with deliberate precision, the quiet click echoing in the silent room. This, she said, her voice low but cutting through the air like a blade, is why I'm here. Jake raised an eyebrow, glancing at the device. It looked unremarkable, just another piece of tech in a galaxy full of gadgets. But the way Ree's fingers lingered on it, and the tension in her voice, told him this wasn't ordinary. And what is this? He asked, tapping the edge of the device with his finger. Ree's hand moved faster than Jake expected, slamming down on his wrist. Her grip was iron-strong, belying her small frame. Don't touch it, she warned, her glowing eyes narrowing. Jake raised his free hand in mock surrender. All right. No touching. She released him, but her intensity didn't waver. It's a tracker, she explained, her voice a quiet storm. A decoy. But it's also bait. Jake tilted his head, intrigued. Bait for what? For them. Ree's gaze flicked toward the entrance of the spaceport. Jake followed her eyes and saw a group entering, tall, armored figures with glowing red visors. The Void Reapers. Their presence was unmistakable, even in a galaxy filled with chaos. The Reapers were notorious bounty hunters, feared across countless systems. Wherever they went, destruction followed. Jake's easygoing demeanor cracked for the first time. You brought the Void Reapers here, he hissed, keeping his voice low. They were already coming, Rye replied, her tone icy. They've been hunting me for weeks. This device, it's the key to everything they want. Jake frowned, his instincts screaming at him to leave. But curiosity, the same trait that had gotten him into trouble countless times before, rooted him in place. And what exactly do they want? Rye hesitated for a moment, as if deciding how much to reveal. Finally, she said, power. Control. The device holds data that could cripple them or make them unstoppable. Jake leaned back, crossing his arms. So, let me guess. You need someone stupid enough to help you get out of this mess. Rye's lips twitched, almost forming a smile. Not stupid. Reckless. There's a difference. Before Jake could respond, a voice boomed across the spaceport. Ree, we know you're here. The Void Reapers spread out, their boots clanging against the metal floor as they scanned the crowd. One of them, larger than the others, stepped forward, holding a device that emitted a piercing red light. The light swept across the room, stopping when it hit Ree's table. The leader's voice turned sharp. There you are. Jake tensed, his hand moving instinctively toward the blaster at his hip. They've got a tracker on you. No, Rye said calmly, pocketing the decoy device. On you. Jake froze. What? Rye's glowing eyes locked onto his, a flicker of something almost apologetic in her expression. They wouldn't follow me here unless I gave them a reason. You sat down, didn't you? Realization hit Jake like a freight ship. The moment he had touched the device, The Reaper's scanners had locked onto his biosignature. His stomach sank. "You used me as bait." "I needed a distraction," Rai said, rising from her chair. Her movements were quick and precise, her cloak swirling around her like a shadow. "And you looked cooperative." Jake opened his mouth to argue, but before he could, Rai grabbed his arm and pulled him to his feet. "Move," she ordered, her voice suddenly full of urgency. The Reapers were closing in, their heavy boots growing louder. Jake barely had time to think before Rai yanked him toward the rear exit of the spaceport. The crowd parted for them, a sea of frightened onlookers too scared to interfere. As they sprinted through the narrow corridors behind the main hall, Jake's mind raced. "You could have at least asked before making me a target. Would you have said yes?" Rai shot back without looking at him. Jake hesitated, then muttered, "Probably not." Exactly. The corridors twisted and turned, the dim lighting casting eerie shadows on the walls. Jake could hear the Reaper's pursuit growing closer. His frustration boiled over. "So what's the plan, genius?" Rai skidded to a stop at a dead end. For a moment, Jake thought they were trapped, but Rai reached into her cloak and pulled out a small disc. She pressed it against the wall, and with a quiet hum, a hidden door slid open, revealing a dark passageway. "This way," she said, stepping through. Jake followed, the door sliding shut behind them, just as the Reapers' voices echoed from the corridor they had left. The sudden quiet was almost unnerving. Jake leaned against the wall, catching his breath. "You're full of surprises, aren't you?" Rai didn't respond immediately. She glanced back at him, her glowing eyes softer now, but still wary. "If you want to survive, you'll need to trust me." Jake snorted. "Trust? You just turned me into a target." Rai's voice lowered, almost a whisper. "And if I hadn't, we'd both be dead by now." For the first time, Jake saw something in her expression. Fear buried beneath her calm exterior. He didn't trust her, not yet, but he couldn't deny that she knew what she was doing. "All right," he said reluctantly. "What's next?" Rai's lips pressed into a thin line. "Now we fight back." The escape. The hidden passage was dark and narrow, lit only by the faint glow of Rai's eyes. Jake followed her closely, his every step echoing against the metallic walls. The air was damp and stale, and the further they moved, the more it felt like they were venturing into the belly of some forgotten beast. Jake's pulse raced, partly from the adrenaline of the chase, but also from the questions buzzing in his mind. "Care to explain why I'm the one they're hunting now?" Jake asked, his voice a low grumble. "You volunteered when you sat at my table," Rai said without looking back. Her tone was as sharp as her movements. "Don't act surprised." Jake muttered under his breath, but kept moving. "You know, most people ask for help before putting a target on someone's back." Rai stopped abruptly, turning to face him. Her glowing eyes pierced through the darkness like twin beacons. "If I had asked, would you have agreed?" Jake opened his mouth to argue but realized he didn't have a good answer. Instead, he sighed and gestured for her to keep moving. "Fine, but this plan of yours better include us getting out alive." "It does," Rai replied, her tone icy. "If you stop complaining and follow me." The sound of distant footsteps grew louder. The Void Reapers had found the hidden passage. Their metallic boots pounded against the floor, and the mechanical hum of their energy scanners sent a chill down Jake's spine. "They're catching up," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "Got any bright ideas?" Rai reached into her cloak and pulled out a small cylindrical device. She twisted it, and the cylinder extended into a sleek, glowing staff. "Stay close and don't get in my way." Before Jake could question her, they emerged into a larger chamber. The space was circular, with high walls and no visible exits. Pipes and wires snaked across the walls, giving the room an industrial, almost abandoned feel. Jake's eyes scanned the area, looking for any way out. "This doesn't exactly scream escape route," he said. "It's not," Rai replied, stepping into the center of the room. "It's a trap." Jake blinked. "A trap? For who?" "For them." She pointed her glowing staff at the passage they had just left. The Void Reapers stormed into the chamber seconds later. There were 6 of them, their crimson visors glowing like the eyes of predators. Their leader, a towering figure clad in sleek black armor, stepped forward. He carried a massive plasma rifle, its barrel humming with deadly energy. "Rye," the leader growled, his voice distorted through his helmet. "Surrender now, and we might let the human live." Rye stood her ground, her staff crackling with energy. "You'll let him live, but you'll take me. And then what? Lock me in one of your labs? Turn me into a weapon?" The leader tilted his head slightly. "That's the idea." Jake frowned, stepping up beside her. "Wait, what's this about turning you into a weapon?" "Not the time for questions, Jake," Rye said, her voice tight. The leader raised his rifle, aiming it directly at her. "This doesn't have to get messy." Rye smirked. "It's already messy." Before the leader could fire, Rye slammed her staff against the ground. A shockwave of bright blue energy erupted from the staff, sending the Void Reapers stumbling backward. Jake shielded his eyes, the light nearly blinding in the dim chamber. When the glow faded, Rye was already moving. She darted toward the nearest Reaper with inhuman speed, her staff spinning in a blur of motion. The first Reaper swung at her with a blade, but she ducked, slamming her staff into his chest. Sparks flew as the Reaper collapsed, his armor smoking. Jake, realizing he couldn't just stand there, drew his blaster. "All right, fine. Let's do this." He fired at another Reaper, his shot striking the visor. The Reaper staggered but didn't fall, instead turning its rifle toward Jake. Jake rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding the blast, and fired again. This time, the shot hit the rifle, causing it to explode in the Reaper's hands. Meanwhile, Rye was a whirlwind of energy and precision. She moved like she was dancing, every strike of her staff perfectly timed and devastatingly effective. One by one, the Reapers fell, their weapons useless against her speed and power. But the leader was different. He moved faster than the others, his attacks more calculated. He blocked Rhee's strikes with a glowing energy shield, countering with brutal swings of his rifle. The chamber echoed with the clash of their weapons. Jake, reloading his blaster, glanced around the room. The remaining Reapers were down, leaving only the leader. But Rhee was starting to slow. Her movements, though still precise, lacked the same sharpness as before. She was tiring. "Rhee," Jake called out. "We got to go." Rhee didn't respond. She locked eyes with the leader, her glowing gaze fierce. "You're not taking me," she said, her voice like steel. The leader chuckled, his shield shimmering. "You can't run forever." With a sudden burst of energy, Rhee swung her staff in a wide arc. The strike shattered the leader's shield, sending shards of blue light scattering across the chamber. But the effort left her vulnerable. The leader grabbed her wrist, twisting it. The staff fell from her hand, clattering to the floor. Jake didn't think. He just acted. He aimed his blaster and fired, the shot grazing the leader's shoulder. The leader snarled, releasing Rhee and turning his attention to Jake. "That's right," Jake said, backing toward the far wall. "Come get me." Rhee, clutching her wrist, grabbed her staff and scrambled to her feet. She glanced at Jake, her eyes wide with something almost like gratitude. "You idiot," she muttered, but there was a hint of a smile. The leader lunged toward Jake, but before he could strike, Rhee swung her staff, releasing another shockwave. The blast knocked the leader off his feet, sending him crashing into the wall. "Now," Rhee shouted, grabbing Jake's arm. "Run." Together, they darted toward a hidden door Rhee activated with a flick of her staff. It slid open, revealing another dark corridor. As they disappeared into the shadows, Jake couldn't help but grin. "This plan of yours," he panted, "is growing on me." Rhee shot him a look. "Don't get used to it." Behind them, the leader's voice echoed in the chamber. You can't run forever. Rye, we'll find you. But for now, they had escaped. Ray's secret power. The narrow corridor stretched endlessly, dimly lit by faint, flickering lights embedded in the walls. Jake stumbled after Ree, who moved with surprising speed despite the obvious strain on her face. Her glowing eyes dimmed slightly, and her breathing grew heavier with each step. Jake couldn't shake the thought that she was far from invincible, no matter how powerful she appeared moments ago. "Hey," Jake called out, finally catching up. "Are we running to a safe place, or just further into trouble?" Rye didn't slow down. "If you want safety, you should have stayed out of this." "Funny," Jake muttered. "I don't remember volunteering to become target practice for galactic bounty hunters." They reached a small chamber at the end of the corridor. The walls were covered in alien script, glowing faintly in soft blue light. Rye approached the center of the room, where a circular console sat, and tapped a sequence into its surface. The door they had entered slid shut with a heavy thud, sealing them inside. Jake frowned, his blaster still clutched tightly. "This doesn't look like an escape route." "It's not," Rye replied curtly. "It's a moment to regroup." Her voice sounded weaker now, and Jake noticed her trembling slightly as she leaned against the console. Sweat beaded on her forehead, and her glowing eyes flickered like a dying flame. For the first time since they met, she looked vulnerable. "Are you okay?" Jake asked, his tone softer. "I'll be fine," Rye said, though her voice lacked conviction. She sank to the floor, sitting cross-legged, and closed her eyes. A faint hum filled the room as the glowing symbols on the walls pulsed in sync with her breathing. Jake stared, unsure what to say. "Bah, are you meditating? Because we kind of have murderous reapers on our trail." Rye opened one eye, glaring at him. "Quiet." "Right. Quiet," Jake muttered, leaning against the wall. He crossed his arms and watched her, his curiosity growing. There was something about Ree that didn't add up. She was clearly more than just another fugitive. But what exactly was she? After a few minutes, Ree's breathing steadied, and the glow in her eyes returned to its previous brightness. She opened both eyes and stood, albeit unsteadily. Jake raised an eyebrow. "Feel better?" "Enough to keep moving," she said, brushing past him toward another console. She pressed a series of buttons, and part of the wall slid open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a small vial filled with swirling blue liquid, glowing faintly. Jake's eyes widened. "What is that?" "Medicine. Energy drink. Alien Kool-Aid." Rye didn't answer immediately. She held the vial carefully, studying it for a moment before slipping it into a pouch on her belt. "It's a last resort." Jake scoffed. "That's not ominous at all." Before he could press further, a loud metallic clang echoed through the chamber. The sealed door at the far end shook violently, denting inward. The Reapers were trying to break through. "Not much time for explanations," Ree muttered. She grabbed her staff, which had been resting against the wall, and turned to face Jake. "Listen carefully. When they get through, I'll hold them off. You run." Jake blinked, surprised. "Run? Are you serious? You're barely standing." "I'm serious," Ray snapped. "You don't know what they're capable of." "And you don't know what I'm capable of," Jake shot back. He raised his blaster. "We fight together, or we don't fight at all." Rye stared at him, her glowing eyes unreadable. For a moment, it seemed like she might argue. Instead, she sighed and muttered, "Humans, always so stubborn." The door burst open with a deafening crash, and the Void Reapers stormed in. Their leader, the towering figure from before, stepped through the wreckage, his crimson visor gleaming in the dim light. "You're out of time, Rye," he said, his distorted voice filling the chamber. "Give us the device, and I might let your new friend live." Jake smirked, aiming his blaster. "Sorry, but I don't negotiate with oversized tin cans." The leader raised his weapon, but before he could fire, Rye stepped forward, holding her staff high. The room seemed to pulse with energy, the walls vibrating as blue light radiated from her. Jake stumbled back, shielding his eyes. "What are you doing?" he shouted. Rai didn't respond. Her glowing eyes intensified, and arcs of energy crackled around her staff. With a single swing, she released a wave of blue light that surged toward the Reapers. The energy slammed into them, sending several flying into the walls. The leader staggered but didn't fall. Jake stared in awe. What the hell was that? Rai's voice was strained but steady. "A fraction of what I can do." The leader recovered quickly, his visor gleaming brighter. "Impressive," he said, "but you can't keep that up forever." Rai swayed slightly, the energy draining from her. Jake saw it immediately. She was running on fumes, her strength barely holding. He stepped forward, firing his blaster at the leader to buy her time. "Got any more tricks up your sleeve?" Jake asked, reloading. Rai hesitated, glancing at the pouch where she had stored the glowing vial. "One," she said quietly, "but you won't like it." The leader raised a device, a glowing red orb that began to hum ominously. "Surrender, or I'll tear this entire chamber apart." Jake gritted his teeth. Whatever you're planning, now's the time." Rai clenched her staff tightly, her glowing eyes meeting Jake's. "When I tell you to run, don't argue." Jake's stomach sank. "No. Run," she shouted, slamming the vial into the staff. A blinding surge of energy erupted from her, engulfing the room in brilliant blue light. Jake had no choice. He turned and sprinted toward the corridor, as the sounds of battle roared behind him. The hidden base. Jake stumbled out of the glowing chaos and into the next corridor, his breath ragged. The air was cold, biting against his skin as he ran. Behind him, the chamber rumbled with the clash of energy blasts and guttural shouts from the Void Reapers. He hesitated for a second, glancing back. "Damn it, Rai," he muttered, clenching his fists. He wanted to go back, but the intensity of the blue light and the raw power shaking the walls told him she had no intention of letting him stay. He sprinted down the corridor, following faint markings Rai had mentioned earlier. Symbols etched into the walls glowed softly, guiding him like breadcrumbs through the dark maze. His blaster felt heavier in his grip as doubt crept into his mind. Was Rai even alive? Was she really planning to escape, or had she stayed behind to make sure he got away? After what felt like hours, the passage opened into a vast chamber. Jake slowed, taking in his surroundings. The room was nothing like the industrial corridors they'd been running through. It was sleek and strangely serene, with glowing panels lining the walls and a faint hum vibrating in the air. A circular console stood in the center, surrounded by transparent screens displaying alien text and swirling star charts. Jake approached cautiously, his blaster raised. "All right, Rai," he muttered, scanning the room. "If this is your so-called safe place, it better live up to the name." A faint clicking sound echoed behind him. He spun around, aiming his blaster at the source. Rai emerged from a hidden door, her hood down, her face pale and sweat-soaked. Her glowing eyes were dimmer now, flickering like dying embers. She held her staff tightly, leaning on it for support. "Don't shoot," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake lowered his weapon and rushed to her side. "You look like hell." "Thanks for the observation," Rai replied dryly, stumbling toward the central console. She tapped a sequence into the panel, and the screens lit up, displaying schematics of a massive Void Reaper ship. Jake recognized it immediately. An infamous cruiser known as the Black Maw, a mobile fortress feared across the galaxy. Rai collapsed into a nearby chair, her breathing shallow. Jake knelt beside her, frowning. "You're pushing yourself too hard. Whatever you did back there, it nearly killed you." "I had no choice," she said, closing her eyes. "If I hadn't, we'd both be dead." Jake sat back, running a hand through his hair. "You've got a habit of dragging people into insane situations. You know that." Rai smirked faintly. "You didn't have to follow me." Jake pointed at the screens. All right, explain this. What are we looking at? Rye opened her eyes and leaned forward. The Black Maw is their flagship. It's where they keep their most valuable prisoners and their secrets. Jake raised an eyebrow. Secrets like the ones in that little device of yours. Exactly. She tapped the pouch on her belt. This isn't just data. It's leverage. Coordinates, encryption codes, and intel on every Void Reaper operation in the sector. With this, we could shut them down. We? Jake repeated, leaning closer. I don't remember signing up for a war. Rye's glowing eyes locked onto his, their light flaring briefly. You signed up the moment you sat at my table. Jake groaned, running a hand down his face. You're unbelievable. The room's hum grew louder, and a holographic image of the cruiser's interior appeared above the console. Rye pointed to a section marked in red. Here, that's where they're keeping my family. Jake's expression softened. Your family. Rye nodded, her voice quieter now. The Reapers took them months ago. I've been running ever since, trying to gather the resources to get them back. This, she gestured to the glowing vial she had used earlier, is all I have left of my people's power. If we're going to save them, we have one shot. Jake frowned, his mind racing. You're telling me you want to infiltrate the Black Maw, one of the most heavily guarded ships in the galaxy, to save your family and bring down the Reapers. With just the two of us. Yes, Rye said simply. Jake stared at her, incredulous. You're insane. Maybe, Rye admitted, leaning back. But it's the only way. Before Jake could argue further, an alarm blared through the chamber. Red lights flashed, and the screens displayed a warning in alien text. Jake didn't need to understand the language to know what it meant. The Reapers had found them. They're here, he said, pulling out his blaster. What now, genius? Rye stood, her exhaustion replaced by a grim determination. She grabbed her staff and activated a secondary panel on the console. A compartment in the wall slid open, revealing a sleek, compact starship. Its surface gleamed like polished obsidian, and its engines hummed softly as it powered up. We take the fight to them, Rye said, stepping toward the ship. Jake hesitated. This isn't just about your family, is it? You're planning to destroy them. Rye glanced back at him, her glowing eyes blazing now. The Void Reapers have taken everything from me. If we don't stop them, they'll keep doing it to others. So, are you in or out? Jake stared at her, then at the ship. He didn't trust her completely. Not yet. But he couldn't walk away now. Not after everything he'd seen. With a resigned sigh, he holstered his blaster and followed her. Let's do this, he said. But if we die, I'm blaming you. Rye smirked. Deal. The ship's hatch opened, and they climbed aboard as the alarms grew louder. The Reapers were coming, but for the first time, Jake felt like they had the upper hand. The final showdown. The starship shot out of the hidden base like a streak of lightning, its engines roaring as it pierced through the asteroid field surrounding them. Jake clung to the co-pilot's chair, his knuckles white as Rye piloted the craft, with near-impossible precision, weaving between massive chunks of rock. The Void Reaper's pursuit ships were close behind, their red energy blasts lighting up the darkness like deadly fireworks. This is your idea of a plan, Jake yelled over the chaos, flying into an asteroid field while being shot at. Would you prefer I let them catch us? Rye snapped, her hand steady on the controls. Jake didn't answer, instead glancing at the radar screen. The Reaper's ships were gaining, their superior speed cutting through the debris with terrifying ease. He gritted his teeth and leaned toward the weapon console. You've got guns on this thing, right? Of course, Rye said. But you'll need to hit something if you're using them. Jake ignored the jab and activated the weapons. A targeting system lit up, and he locked onto the nearest enemy ship. Time to see what this baby can do, he muttered, firing a barrage of energy bolts. The first few shots missed, but the fourth struck true, exploding the Reaper ship in a flash of red and white. One down, Jake shouted. 4 to go, Rye replied, banking hard to avoid a collision. The ship's hull groaned under the strain, but it held. We need to lose them before we reach the Black Maw. If they follow us there, we're as good as dead. Jake frowned, focusing on the targeting system. What's the plan when we get there? Rye hesitated, her jaw tightening. The device has a failsafe. If we can get it to the central core of the Black Maw, we can overload their systems and disable the entire ship. Sounds simple enough, Jake said sarcastically, firing another volley at a pursuing ship. It dodged, returning fire that rattled their shields, except for the part where they kill us first. Rye didn't respond, her focus locked on the controls. She pulled the ship into a sharp climb, dodging a hail of enemy fire, then dove into a dense cluster of asteroids. The maneuver was so tight that Jake felt his stomach lurch. The Reapers followed, but one miscalculated, slamming into an asteroid and erupting in a fiery explosion. 3 left, Jake muttered, a bead of sweat rolling down his temple. Make it 2, Rye said, flipping a switch on her console. The ship's rear cannons activated, unleashing a storm of energy bolts that caught another Reaper ship in its path. The explosion lit up the asteroid field, temporarily blinding their remaining pursuers. Jake whooped, but the celebration was short-lived. The radar pinged loudly, signaling a new massive presence entering the area. Jake's heart sank as the Black Maw loomed into view, its enormous silhouette blotting out the stars. The fortress was more than a ship. It was a leviathan, bristling with weapons and defenses that could obliterate a fleet. "We're here," Rye said grimly. "Strap in." Jake glanced at her, his mouth dry. "How are we supposed to get inside that thing? We're a speck compared to them." Rye's glowing eyes met his, unwavering. "They won't expect us to attack head-on." "That's because it's suicide," Jake shouted. "Exactly," Rye said, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. Before Jake could argue, she accelerated toward the cruiser, her hands moving rapidly across the controls. The ship vibrated as it approached, dodging incoming fire from the cruiser's massive cannons. Jake braced himself as Ray fired an EMP blast from the ship's underside. The pulse rippled through the air, disrupting the cruiser's shields just long enough for them to slip through an exposed hangar bay. The landing was rough, the ship skidding across the metal floor and smashing into a stack of cargo crates. Jake groaned, unbuckling himself from his seat. "Remind me never to let you drive again." Rye ignored him, grabbing her staff and the glowing device from her pouch. "We need to move. Their security teams will be here any second." The hangar was already swarming with Reaper drones, their glowing red eyes scanning for intruders. Jake fired his blaster, taking down 2 drones before they could react. Ree charged ahead, her staff crackling with energy. She swung it in a wide arc, releasing a shockwave that dismantled the remaining drones in an instant. "Show off," Jake muttered, following her toward a nearby elevator. The 2 stepped inside, and Ree pressed a sequence on the control panel. The elevator shot upward, the walls vibrating as alarms blared throughout the ship. Jake glanced at her, his heart pounding. "What happens if we don't make it to the core in time?" "We won't have to worry about that," Rye said, her tone colder than usual. "Because they'll kill us before it matters." Jake rolled his eyes. Comforting. The elevator doors slid open to reveal the cruiser's central hub. The room was vast, dominated by a glowing reactor core pulsing with crimson energy. Reaper soldiers surrounded the area, their weapons aimed and ready. The leader stepped forward, his visor glinting in the harsh light. "You've made a grave mistake coming here, Rye." Rye stepped out of the elevator, her staff glowing brighter than ever. "The only mistake was thinking I'd let you win." Jake sighed, raising his blaster. Here we go again. The final battle had begun. The heroic sacrifice. The tension in the core room was suffocating. The reactor's crimson glow bathed everything in an eerie red light, casting long shadows across the metallic floor. The Void Reaper leader stood at the forefront of his troops, his energy blade humming ominously. Behind him, Rows of heavily armored soldiers aimed their rifles, ready to fire at a moment's notice. Jake shifted uneasily, his blaster aimed at the nearest Reaper. This isn't exactly the heroic final stand I had in mind. Rye, standing beside him, didn't flinch. Her glowing eyes were steady, locked on the leader. The energy from her staff pulsed faintly, mirroring the rhythm of the reactor core. She stepped forward, her voice calm but resolute. "It's over, Reaper. You've lost." The leader chuckled, his distorted voice echoing through the chamber. "You're outnumbered, outgunned, and cornered. What could you possibly do?" Rai didn't answer immediately. Instead, she raised the device from her pouch, its glowing blue lines sparking to life. The Reapers stiffened at the sight of it, and the leader's visor flared as he realized what she held. "You wouldn't," he growled. "Oh, I would," Rai replied, her voice icy. She turned to Jake, her expression unreadable. "When I activate this, the core will overload. This entire ship, and everyone on it, will be destroyed." Jake's stomach dropped. "Wait. Destroyed. As in, we're included in everyone, right?" Ray nodded. "There's no other way." Jake shook his head, stepping closer to her. "Ree, we came here to save your family, not get blown to pieces." "They're already gone," Rai said quietly, her glowing eyes dimming. "The Reapers lied. I found the logs. They executed my people weeks ago." The words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. He glanced at the leader, whose silence confirmed the truth. "You knew this whole time," he shouted, his blaster trembling in his hand. The leader shrugged. "They were a liability, just like you are." Jake turned back to Ree, his voice softer now. "Then why are we still here? Let's get out and fight another day." "I can't," Rai said, her grip tightening on the device. "This ship is their command center. If we destroy it, we cripple their operations. We give others a chance to fight back." "And what about you?" Jake asked, his voice breaking slightly. "You deserve more than this." Rai smiled faintly, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. "This is more than I ever hoped for. To take them down, to give people hope. That's enough." Jake clenched his jaw, torn between anger and admiration. Before he could say more, the Reaper leader raised his blade, his voice sharp. "Enough talking. Hand over the device, or I'll cut you both down right now." Rai didn't hesitate. She pressed a button on the device, and a high-pitched whine filled the room as the reactor core began to destabilize. The red glow intensified, and warning sirens blared throughout the ship. "No," the leader roared, lunging toward Rai. Jake reacted instinctively, firing his blaster at the leader. The shot hit his shoulder, knocking him off balance, but it wasn't enough to stop him. The other Reapers opened fire, and Jake ducked behind a console, returning fire as best he could. Rai stepped into the chaos, her staff blazing with energy. She moved like a force of nature, her strikes precise and devastating. Each swing of her staff sent shockwaves through the room, scattering soldiers like leaves in a storm. But even as she fought, Jake could see the toll it was taking on her. She was running out of time. "Ree," Jake shouted, his voice barely audible over the noise. "We've got to go." Rai didn't answer. She was locked in combat with the leader, their weapons clashing in a dazzling display of light and sound. The reactor's glow grew brighter, and Jake felt the floor begin to shake. "You're too late," the leader snarled, swinging his blade at Rai. She blocked the strike with her staff, the force of the impact sending sparks flying. "No," she said, her voice steady. "You are." With a final surge of energy, she disarmed the leader, sending his blade skidding across the floor. She raised her staff, its light pulsing one last time, and struck him down. The leader collapsed, his armor smoking, but Reed didn't pause to celebrate. She turned to Jake, her expression calm but urgent. "Go. Now." Jake hesitated, his chest tightening. "Not without you." Reed shook her head, pressing the device into his hands. "You have to live. Tell people what happened here. Make sure they know the Reapers can be stopped." The reactor groaned loudly, cracks spreading across its surface as energy surged within. Jake's eyes burned, his throat tightening. He didn't want to leave her. Not like this. "Really?" he started. "Go," she shouted, pushing him toward the elevator. Jake stumbled backward, his heart breaking as he looked at her one last time. She turned away, her glowing eyes fixed on the reactor, and raised her staff. The doors closed, and Jake felt the elevator shoot downward. As the ship shook violently, Jake sprinted toward the hangar bay. He climbed into their ship, his hands trembling as he powered it up. The engines roared to life, and he blasted out of the hangar just as the black maw erupted in a blinding explosion. The force of the blast rocked his ship, but he managed to stabilize it, watching as the Reaper cruiser disintegrated into a million fiery fragments. Jake slumped in his seat, staring at the wreckage in silence. The weight of what had happened pressed down on him, but he knew Ree's sacrifice wasn't in vain. The galaxy had lost a hero, but it had also gained a chance to fight back. As he set a course for the nearest colony, Jake clutched the device in his hand, its blue glow a reminder of the light Rye had brought into the darkness.